Thank you, Melanie. So I'm not a huge reader, so this was other than scientific articles, so I don't read for pleasure much, but I had a wonderful time reading this book, and I hope you did too. I found it very interesting mix of the history of the Great Lakes, sailing of the Great Lakes, a description of all the cool things about the Great Lakes, and I really actually got into it. And I actually changed my talk a little bit after I read it. And I don't know what the other presentations presented to you, but I wanted to kind of start way back in history and just show a little bit of how the Great Lakes were formed, go into more of the history of the fishing in the Great Lakes, and then finish with the biological threats of the Great Lakes, and hope to get your support to combat future threats to the Great Lakes. So I have some history of the Great Lakes. My parents owned a sailboat, a 30-foot sailboat that we could stay on and live for a few days on. And it was on Lake Michigan. And we used to stay in the ports of White Lake and Muskegon. If you are sailors, those are really neat ports to stay in, because if Lake Michigan's really bouncy and 6-foot waves, those lakes are very big and you can do a lot of sailing within those lakes. So it was fun. I've sailed up and down the coast and trips across the lake as well. So I experienced a little bit about what the author Dennis had experienced. As an undergrad, I worked on Lake Michigan, so spent a lot of time out there doing research on Chinook salmon. And my graduate work was also on Chinook salmon, so got to spend some time on research vessels on the lake as well. All of my experience has been on Lake Michigan, so that's mostly what I'm going to talk about, but going through some of the history stuff, I'm going to try to touch on each of the Great Lakes. So we'll get right into it. So like I mentioned, I hope you all know what the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Superior, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. I'm going to talk about a little bit about how they're formed. I don't want to get into a lot of discussion on glacial history, but it is what formed the lakes and makes them so special. And then just describe a little bit more about each lake. The author did a good job of this, but just to kind of get you visually thinking about how special these lakes are, and then start talking more about the Lake Michigan fishery and different things about Lake Michigan. And if you have questions at any point, please ask. We don't have to wait to the end. This is about you learning as well. So raise your hand or pipe up or anything if you got a question or comment. So as we know, the glaciers formed the Great Lakes, and there are 3 primary lobes of ice that came down about 10,000 years ago. And there's the Saginaw lobe, Lake Michigan lobe, Green Bay lobe, and I guess there's a 4th, the Lake Erie lobe. So as that ice pressure pushed down, it just basically plowed the earth away. In fact, if any of you have been in Canada and parts of the UP, it actually scoured all of the dirt right to bedrock in a lot of those areas. And as the ice then retreated, it started to leave different moraines around, different hills and stuff. And for us in Kalamazoo, all the hills that we were driving up and down around here, they're all left behind by the glaciers. If you've ever driven D Avenue across the Kalamazoo River and you kind of go down one side over the river and up the other, those are basically where, when the glaciers started to melt, there was a glacial river there, and it formed that big valley with all the water melting from the glaciers, left a huge depression there, and now that's where the Kalamazoo River runs. And most of our river systems in Michigan flow through these old glacial river valleys. So as the ice started to retreat to the north, the lake started to fill. We see there was a big connection. This is actually the Grand River Valley now. If you're ever, same type of idea, if you've ever driven into Ionia, going north to south, you cross a huge valley, and that's what was formed through ice melting. And there's actually a connection at one time between Lake Michigan and what's now Saginaw Bay. And that connection can actually still be seen today. This is a map of the Grand River watershed, and the orange or lighter areas are higher elevation, and the blue areas are low elevation. And all that blue area is where that glacial runoff and where the connection between Lake Michigan and Saginaw Bay was. And so if you continue this way, you go to Saginaw Bay. And it was so flat through here that at one time they were going to dredge about 10 miles of that and have a actual shipping canal that was going to connect Lake Huron to Lake Michigan, going right through the straight through the middle of Michigan. But that never materialized, but they were close to doing that. So what makes the Great Lakes so special, and I think you've heard this through the years, is it contains a fifth of the world's surface water, fresh water. And that is just incredible to think that it's right here in our backyard. Over 84% of North America's fresh water is here. It's the most fresh water in any one place other than the polar caps, ice caps. So it is something special that we need to enjoy and also protect. So a comparison of all the Great Lakes. Average depth, Lake Superior is the deepest with an average depth of over 480 feet. Ontario has the second average depth, that's 280. Lake Michigan almost 280. Huron a little shallower, and then Lake Erie is the shallowest. But the maximum depth, which is incredible, is over 1,300 feet in Lake Superior. So it's a very deep lake system. Lake Michigan has 925 feet. And then even Lake Erie, being shallow, is over 200 feet. So pretty impressive. And you can see the volumes there as well, so lots of water. The amount of shore, the area.
What's that measurement volume? Is that cubic miles or?
I think it is cubic miles. So I think you can put so many feet of water over the entire United States just from what's in the Great Lakes. So, and there, an area is square miles. So Lake Superior, again, the largest, over 31,000 square miles. When you look at the shoreline, and I'll show some pictures in a minute, the one that kind of sticks out is Lake Huron. It actually has the most shoreline out of all the Great Lakes. And when we see a picture of it, there's just hundreds of islands in Lake Huron that's on the Canadian side that you'll see, and that's what makes up that shoreline. Retention. To think about retention, this is how many years it takes to replenish all the water that's in one of these lakes. So in Lake Superior, 191 years to basically for new water to replace the water that's there. So that's important to protect because it would take that long to flush out any bad things that we got in there. The shallower the lakes is Lake Erie, that replenishes itself every 2.6 years. So that's more of a flushing lake. The rest of these lakes maintain their water for many years. So Lake Superior, this is kind of gives you a visual of it. This is Isle Royal, one of our national parks. The book talked about the Soo Locks in the St. Mary's River system, which comes down here and then connects to Lake Huron. Most of the shoreline is rocky. That's kind of because the glaciers kind of carved most of the sands and silts away, so there's not a lot of sand in the system, mostly rocky shore. And today the main sport fish there is lake trout. They naturally reproduce there. There's no stocking. There's also lots of ciscos and whitefish. So these are primarily they're char type. The trout is a char. It wants really cold water, so they live several hundred feet on the bottom and love the cold water. Other species just can't withstand the how cold Lake Superior is. Lake Huron, the eastern side of Michigan. This is also primarily rocky. You get more silty areas through Saginaw Bay. But these are all the different islands I was talking about and what makes the shoreline miles so long. This is Georgian Bay, and there's, just literally hundreds of miles through there. Most of them rocky type shores. Some have houses on them, some don't, but it's a pretty neat place. Lake Huron, having Saginaw Bay, which is fairly shallow, and the Saginaw River system has a warm water fish called a walleye, which is very popular, and yellow perch. They're a popular fish. And then in the deeper part of the basin does stay cold, and we have natural lake trout that are starting to reproduce again. At one time, lake trout were completely lost in Lake Huron. Now they're coming back and naturally reproducing, and stocking has been reduced considerably. This is Lake Erie. Huron would be here. You come down through the Detroit River into Lake St. Clair. This is the city of Detroit, down the Detroit River, and then we have Lake Erie here. Lake Erie's probably, it's got the most population around it. It drains, all the upper Great Lakes drain through it, and it's got lots of farmland from Ohio and southern Michigan that drain into it, and it's the lake that's probably had the most pollution, if you will. It's been publicized, that people have learned about. There's been rivers that have been burned because of petroleum on the water surface. There's been algae blooms that have caused fish kills, and a lot of it's because the lake is shallow, it's warm, and it's got a lot of nutrients and other pollution that has come into it from runoff from the area. Given that it's a warmer lake system, it does have warmer type fish in terms of walleye, smallmouth bass, yellow perch are the popular species there. Yeah.
On the slide before, you had the St. Mary's River, and we own property right on the St. Mary's River, looking at Canada. And one thing we've been alarmed about is they do fish, we have sports fishing and stuff like that, and if people pick up, they get some walleye, a lot of
Northern pike, yeah.
Yeah, pike. But when we're looking at the water, you don't see little bitty fishes swimming around next to the shore. I mean, it's very. We kept looking and see where are all the little fishes. And so, is there a problem in the St. Mary's that we don't know about? We don't see hardly any small minnows of any kind. I don't know what I'm looking for. I just don't see anything.
Right. I don't know exactly what's happening there, but typically the Great Lakes are so clear now that fish are very skittish during the day. If you went out at night, so one way that we used to collect minnows on Lake Michigan is we'd go out in the middle of the night with a beach seine. So if you're out on Lake Michigan, probably similar to St. Mary's River, and you're walking around or swimming, all you see is a sandy bottom pretty much. You don't see much. You go out there at night, and we can do 100-foot beach seine, bring it in, and we literally have thousands of different kinds of minnows and small trout and alewife there. So they kind of move off into darker areas during the day, and then they come back in during night. So that might be the problem, but also productivity in all the lake systems is down compared to what it was in the 70s. So if you may remember seeing more alewife and other fish there in the 70s and 80s, the lakes can't support that kind of production anymore. So, because of zebra mussels, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And this is Lake Ontario, a lake that I don't know as much about. I don't show the connection very well, but this is the Niagara River, and Niagara Falls are there, so the Lake Ontario is completely separated from the upper Great Lakes by the falls, at least it historically used to be. But it's still a very deep lake. It has Atlantic salmon in it that have been in there. There's some argument whether they're historically always there or they've at least been in there since the early 1800s, but also has a salmon fishery similar to Lake Michigan.
How's the boats go from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario to the big falls there?
Yeah, so in the 1800s they built the Welland Canal, which is a bypass. They put lock systems in there, which is a bypass from the Niagara Falls. So because of that, it opened up the Great Lakes to lots of different biological species that I'll talk about in a minute. So I've finished with Lake Michigan, and most of the talk from here on out will be Lake Michigan, but what I talk about in Lake Michigan relates a lot to the other Great Lakes. They experienced a lot of the same changes through history. Lake Michigan right now is primarily a salmon fishery, Chinook salmon, coho. There's some lake trout, but they aren't naturally reproducing. They have to be stocked. And some of our rivers and nearshore areas do have some warm water species like smallmouth bass and walleye. It's separated from Huron really only by a bridge. Technically, Lake Michigan and Huron should be the same lake. They're at the same elevation, and biologically we should be treating them the same. It's basically just the straits that separate them. The author was from the Traverse City, Platte Bay area and talked a lot about the Sleeping Bear Dunes. If you haven't been there, that's a picture of them. They're magnificent, so if you ever get up that way, it's worth a trip. If you run down, it's very difficult to get back up, and you might want to walk over to Empire. It's an easier trip. So, but you know the major cities, obviously Chicago, major ports on the Michigan side are New Buffalo, St. Joe, South Haven, Holland, Grand Haven, Muskegon, Whitehall, Pentwater, Ludington, Frankfort, around the Traverse City, Charlevoix, Petoskey. So, oh, yes.
I'm from Lake Michigan.
Good. What part?
In the city of Lake Michigan, and they have a big lake there. And my mom and dad lives there, and I'm their son.
Okay.
I'm out there in Hartman. My family lives in Lake Michigan.
Okay.
So when I seen that, I said, wow, that's my town there. I go fishing a lot.
Good. So going back in history, there's always been fishing, you know, at least back since Native Americans been here. They fished up and down the coast of Lake Michigan when they can get access. As you read from the book, these Great Lakes can be very threatening at times with high waves and winds. So when they could get out in calm days, they would fish the shoreline, mostly with spears. As they learned, they figured out some netting and trapping techniques through time. But their primary species that they would go after were lake sturgeon. Lake sturgeon spend most of their time in the Great Lakes themselves, and then will spawn in larger river systems like the Kalamazoo River. Used to have a huge population of lake sturgeon, so did the St. Joe, Grand Rivers. Lake sturgeon are interesting species in that the females don't mature until they're about 20 years old. So after they hatch as an egg in a river, they migrate down to, in this instance, Lake Michigan. They won't come back to the river for 20 years. And then they'll spawn, once they start spawning, they spawn about every other year to every fourth year. And they can reach huge sizes. I don't know what they were historically, but we still see lake sturgeon in the Kalamazoo River approaching 190 pounds. So magnificent fish. They're old. The fish that we see, some of them are 70, 80 years old. So a neat species, and the Indians respected them tremendously and would spear a few, but always allowed the population to continue. Lake trout were another important species for them, and especially when the lake trout would spawn in the fall and come near shore. And then whitefish was another important species, which is now a commercially harvested species in the Great Lakes.
Is that commercially harvested on Lake Michigan?
Yes,
Whitefish?
yep. So whitefish are commercially harvested primarily Lake Superior, Huron, and Lake Michigan. So as Europeans showed up in the Great Lakes area, they brought more technology, schooner boats. These are probably similar boats that the author talked about in the book. They brought more sophisticated netting and used fish for feeding their families, but also used fish as a way to gain money. So people made a living off of it. As towns sprung up along the Great Lakes, fishing was a main source of money, and you had to feed those people in the towns. So a commercial type fishery started very early in the Great Lakes. As technology increased and we had steamboats on the scene and later gas engines, boats were able to go out for longer trips, go out deeper, and set even bigger nets. And the hauls of fish that they would bring in, they were sometimes, I've read up to 119 million pounds of fish coming out of Lake Michigan, even in the late 1800s. So it didn't take long, and they were really exploiting the Great Lakes for its fish resources.
What species were they?
Lake trout, whitefish, bloater chub, which is a smaller chub that's often smoked, and then common carp were introduced in the 1800s when Asian immigrants started to come into the U.S. more. They wanted to bring some of the fish that they were used to, so they brought in the common carp as a food source. And they took right off in the Great Lakes and did well, and common carp became a common fish that was sampled in the commercial fishery. The author talked about a little town called Leland. Has anyone been up into that area at all? It's a beautiful little town, and it basically built itself around a commercial fishery. And it's one of the only towns that's maintained its character. I'm not sure what year this one was taken, but if you go there now, it looks very similar other than the boats have changed them. It's called Leland, also known as Fish Town, on the Leland Peninsula just west of Traverse City. Yep. But it's a great place to visit and just get a feel of what that historic fishery was like at the time. So it didn't take long because so many fish were taken and shipped to Chicago, taken to Detroit to feed the people coming into these cities that it pretty much collapsed. It started to collapse really in the late 1800s. It was unrestricted. You basically didn't need a license. You could take as many fish as you wanted. People were greedy, so the more you went out, the more you got, the less other people would get. So you'd fish all the time and try to get as much as you could. Technology changed with nylon gill nets, which really helped. They could get out with better engines. And there's basically no limit until 1929 is when the first commercial licenses were taken. And even back then, they realized that they were over-harvesting the fish that were there, so they started to enact size limits, seasons, and somewhat quotas, but it was unrestricted in terms of the number of commercial fishermen that could be there. I'll talk about invasive species in a minute, but with invasive species coming in, pollution problems from the industry that was happening there, and habitat loss, the fish species that they were after basically all collapsed. by the 1950s. The commercial fishery was just about done. And the poundage went down, what they're taking out of the lake by about 60%. And they no longer were catching lake trout, they were no longer catching whitefish or the bloater chubs, and it was switching more to a new species that came in called alewife, still catching the common carp, and that was primarily it for quite a while. We're not sure how many fishers there were back in the 1800s because no one kept track, but we're figuring at least 10 to 20,000 different commercial fisheries just in Lake Michigan, fishermen. And today we're down to 35. That gives you an idea of how much it's changed. Now they are completely regulated. They have quotas on how much fish they can take. And we also have to allocate the fishery. We split it out between commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, and tribal fishermen. So that's how it's regulated today. And some of the same species, some of the species are coming back in terms of lake trout, which they are catching, and whitefish.
We have a better environment today than they did then.
I would say, yeah, it could be better now than it was. At least certain aspects are better now than it was at the turn of the 1900s. Pollution-wise, it got really bad probably between 1920 and 1960. That was probably the worst. 1960 to 70 was the worst that pollution was in the Great Lakes. And then the Great Lakes pollution actually is one of the reasons the Clean Water Act was created, which put a lot of regulations on industry. And since then, the lakes have cleaned up tremendously. So the book talked about a lot of this habitat destruction, and a lot of it occurred along the lakeshore. I mean, this is, I think, Gary, Indiana, but there's channels that are dug, factories on it, and historically that would have been a marsh area full of ducks, full of spawning areas for fish, and it basically was taken over and filled in and dredged these dikes. So that's habitat destruction that happened, which led to part of the fishery collapse. The logging era in Michigan, pretty much the entire state of Michigan was logged off for its white pine. And those logs were floated down rivers to mills that were typically along Lake Michigan, where they could be loaded up on schooner boats and things. And the act of floating those logs down our rivers really changed our river systems and made them wider, and made the banks of roads. We had a huge amount of sediment coming into Lake Michigan and flowing down our rivers just from the logging era. And they recognized that water was a use of power, so mills started up, and then pretty soon hydropower started, so dams were built pretty much on every river system. And if you're a lake sturgeon and you have to swim up a river to spawn, you basically lost your connectivity to your spawning site. So lake sturgeon basically got to the point where they're very low numbers, and now today they are a threatened species in Michigan. But they are recovering. There's a lot of, we're doing dam removals. We are doing streamside rearing and hatchery type work with sturgeon. The populations are starting to come back, but they were almost lost because of overfishing and because of habitat destruction. So you had mentioned how are boats and how are fish actually getting around the Niagara Falls. And it was basically this well and canal that was built. And the book talks about their trip down through there, but there's a series of locks that basically, if you're coming from Lake Ontario, will lift you up the elevation to get into Lake Erie. And you can, this is a little bit hard to see, but if you come up and look at this map, this is the depth of the lakes and the elevation they're at, and you can see this drop. This is between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, so it was quite quite an engineering feat to provide an access for ocean-going ships to get up into Lake Erie. So, but now, because of that, the Great Lakes are connected to the world. Ocean-going ships basically take on cargo from all over the place. A lot of our invasive species are coming from the Baltic Sea, and these ships bring on their cargo, and then they also bring on ballast water. So they're bringing in water from the Baltic Sea, coming all the way over and up the St. Lawrence Seaway across Lake Ontario and through this canal system. And unfortunately, when they get here, they dump off their cargo and their ballast water, and that's where a lot of our invasive species are coming from. The canal also allowed, when this canal system was built and the St. Lawrence Seaway was built with lock systems as well, that allowed species like sea lamprey and alewife to migrate up into Lake Ontario, and then they could also use the locks to get into the Great Lakes. So those type of species, they either can swim their way in now, or they ride in on ships.
I'm curious why they couldn't exchange their ballast water before they came into St. Lawrence Seaway.
Yeah, it's a great question. Even when it was known that that was how they were coming in, there was just a lot of reluctance to change. Now they are forced to do an exchange, but it may still not be enough to kill off the species that are in there. We're finding that these species that are being introduced can live in salt water and fresh water, so you also need a disinfecting agent almost when you make the exchange to truly kill off anything that's hitchhiking with them. So the two big ones that came in that really changed the fishery are the sea lamprey, and you may have heard about this through the years. It's a parasitic fish, and it likes to attach to larger fish, and then with these teeth, after it's attached, these teeth keep working through the skin until they basically get through the outer protective skin layer, and then they can start basically sucking the juices out of the fish. They just start sucking the blood out of them. And most parasites won't kill their host, because if you kill your host, you're done. But these, for some reason, injured the fish enough that they actually started killing the fish. And that, along with commercial fishing, sea lamprey basically killed off whatever was remaining. Lake trout numbers plummeted. Any other predatory fish in the lake also died because of the sea lamprey. So we had a lake with no predators at all, and then this other fish came in, which is called the alewife. And once alewife reached the Great Lakes, they reproduced like crazy and basically overpopulated the lake. And I don't know if, I'm sure some of you remember if you ever visited the Great Lakes or Lake Michigan shoreline in the 60s. I even remember it still in the 80s being fairly bad. There were these little silver fish washed up everywhere, and it just made a stinky mess. I'm not sure where this picture was taken, but pretty typical of the time, just thousands of dead fish on the shoreline. So this created a huge problem that really needed to be solved because tourism was going down. They tried to commercially harvest these fish. They were successful at collecting them, but there just wasn't a good market for them. They weren't marketed as human food. They were marketed for pet food, and they just weren't getting enough money to make it worth it for them. So a couple of things happened. First, the federal government got involved, and the Great Lakes Fish Commission was started in the 50s. And the primary purpose of that agency was to figure out how to control sea lamprey. And after lots of studying, they finally understood the life history a little bit about sea lamprey. Sea lamprey migrate up rivers to spawn. And once they do spawn, their larvae, called amicetes, live in the stream for anywhere from 3 to 10 years. And they basically sit in the mud. They're not parasitic at that point. They basically filter, feed out of the water. So they knew that they were vulnerable at that time. So they found, out of a lot of research, found a chemical called TFM that could be sprayed in the rivers and would basically kill these ammosetes before they turned into adults and out-migrated to the lake. So in the late 50s, that program, TFM and treatment of streams started, and sea lamprey levels immediately started to go down in the Great Lakes and Lake Michigan. And once the sea lamprey went down, lake trout started to come back. So it was a very positive situation. We still have to treat streams today. It's a $25 million price tag every year to treat streams in Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, and throughout Canada, just to keep this one invasive species down. Without it, they would
What else did that
respond.
stuff kill besides the lamprey? I don't know how you could be species specific.
Yeah, it's fair. I'll say it's pretty good. It's fairly specific to lamprey. It also kills our native lamprey. We actually have silver and chestnut brook lampreys that were native to here. They're not as ferocious as these sea lampreys, so it does kill our native lamprey. And if local area concentrations get high, we do see mud puppies, and which is an amphibian, basically a big salamander. It's hard on those. And we do occasionally see die-offs of other small fish like darters and minnows and things. So it is a price to pay when these river systems are treated.
We have property on the Bacterial River about 5 years ago. They had low flow conditions, and they put the lampricide in, and they killed thousands of salmon. They're all over the side of the river.
Yeah.
Because they evidently put in too much.
Yeah, and that does happen. Last year on the Muskegon River, they had a hotter application, and we had a die-off of some salmon, not to the degree that was. And we also saw larval dead, or juvenile dead sturgeon on the Muskegon last year. So there are non-target mortalities for sure. So there's still work to be done there to find better ways to control the lamprey. To control the alewife, now that sea lamprey numbers were down, we're starting to see lake trout come back. But lake trout, the only lake trout that were surviving were ones that were stocked. We weren't seeing any natural reproduction from lake trout. Part of the reason is these alewife were the only prey source out there. And when lake trout ate them, alewife have a enzyme called thymidase in them, which takes away your vitamin B. So all the eggs that were basically laid by lake trout didn't have enough vitamin B in the eggs, so the eggs wouldn't survive or hatch. So controlling alewife was another piece of the puzzle if we were going to get some of our native species back. So in the late 1960s, the DNR director at the time, Dr. Howard Tanner, decided to bring in coho and Chinook salmon. So along the Platte River, the Platte River State Fish Hatchery was formed. So if you're ever up that way, it's still in existence and still raises coho salmon. They started stocking hundreds of thousands of these salmon into Lake Michigan and the other Great Lakes. And within 2 years, they realized that it was going to be a huge success. Coho were coming back over 20 pounds in just a year and a half to 2 years. And it started an immediate fishery. The book talked a little bit about this, but no one really knew how to fish for them. They were bringing their basic little boats in from inland waters, casting lures out, catching these fish, which was basically fantastic. It created a whole new enthusiasm for the Great Lakes. People were traveling here from all over the Midwest to experience this new fishery. But as the book mentioned in one part, people weren't really prepared for how vicious the Great Lakes can become, especially in the fall. And they had episodes with really high winds and high waves, and people were still going out in these little tiny boats and just had that salmon fever, and people actually died and lost their boats or had to beach their boats because of that. So a lot more Coast Guard programs started to teach people how to experience the Great Lakes safely. A lot more weather reports became available just because of that episode on Platte Bay.
Do the coho reproduce in the stream?
Some coho do, but a lot of Chinook salmon do. Coho have a different life cycle in which once they spawn in a stream, the larvae hatch, live in the gravel for a while, and then once they emerge, they actually stay in the river a full year. So they're already a year and a half, these larvae, before they outmigrate. And so they need really cold water, like 55-degree water, that whole year and a half. So they can, if they can find the right streams, typically cold water trout streams, they can reproduce.
You talking about Chinook or?
Coho. Chinook salmon only stay, so when they spawn in the fall and they hatch, they're out migrating that following spring. So they don't need as cold a water because it's typically fall and winter when they're in there. So they can reproduce in a lot more streams than the coho can.
And the alewife enzyme doesn't affect their
It does, but not to the degree that it does the lake trout. So, but we do see, even in our hatchery system, we have to test for vitamin B, and actually we put a vitamin B fluid over the eggs sometimes when we know it's going to be an issue. Because even in the hatchery system, we see these eggs die off. So occasionally we still have to put vitamin B in with the Chinook eggs and the coho eggs just to see the survival.
One other question, and that's regarding the sea lamprey. Is there a natural predator for sea lamprey?
Only when they're larvae in the rivers there seems to be, because they just stay in the bottom and just stick their head out to feed. So we know lake sturgeon will eat them, sometimes some carp will, and bass and things that are swimming on the bottom, but not enough to control their population. It's interesting because on the Pacific Ocean, on the west side of the United States, the Pacific sea lamprey is endangered. So it's just kind of interesting. And then in the Great Lakes, we have a sea lamprey we have to basically try to kill off. So it is a delicacy in Asian markets. So we've been trying to get commercial fishermen involved to see if they'd harvest enough to control their populations, but it's never taken off so far. So because of the introduction of salmon, the whole Great Lakes coast and really industry changed. A lot of these towns that were along the coast switched from being industrial based. The industries left and they were basically turned over to tourist towns. A good example is St. Joe. I mean, most of this riverfront was all industrial at one time, and it's since been cleaned up, industry removed, and been replaced by marinas. And these marinas are basically charter boats that are out there fishing, pleasure boats that are out there fishing, and just pleasure boats that are going out and enjoying the Great Lakes. This is a more modern picture of that town called Leland. Very few, if any, commercial fishing boats there, but it's got charter boats and more pleasure boats. But what's so neat about it is the old buildings and everything are still there. So the fishing industry in the Great Lakes now is over a $7 billion a year industry. So pretty impressive. So everything that goes up must come down, we usually say. And with Chinook salmon and the salmon fisheries in the Great Lakes, they are on their way down. And we've actually seen a collapse in the salmon fishery in Lake Huron. They're totally pretty much non-existent as part of the fishery there now. And what we basically saw early on in the early 60s, pretty much everything that was out in the lake is what we stocked. And then we started to see the pattern shift, and you asked about natural reproduction. Sometime in the 80s or so, we started to see an increase of Chinook salmon natural reproduction. Not sure if it might be partly because our rivers cleaned up because of less pollution in them, so they could reproduce. But anyway, natural reproduction became a more significant part of what's out in the lake. So the combination of us stocking and the natural reproduction, our salmon numbers peaked in the mid-80s. We had more salmon out there than ever before. And at the same time, we had a huge disease outbreak called bacterial kidney disease that wiped out the salmon for several years in Lake Michigan. And it was all basically hinged upon that they had started to eat all those alewife that were out there, all those alewife that were washing up on the beaches. These salmon did such a wonderful job that they were actually eating too many and they were getting malnourished. And that presented a situation where a disease outbreak could start. So that was our first warning sign that the lakes were starting to change again. So we've been reducing stocking ever since, with the major reduction in '96, another one in 2006, and just another reduction in 2013. And what we're also finding is, as we reduce the stocking, the wild production also has started to reduce, go down. And it's basically because the lakes aren't productive as they were, and there's just not enough prey out there to support all of those salmon. And I can show you some figures on that. So this is the prey biomass that was in Lake Michigan. It was primarily made up of the gray, which is alewife, and the bloater chubs, which is a deeper water fish. And then around the early 2000s, we've got something called the zebra mussel that came into the Great Lakes, which followed with its close cousin, the quagga mussel. And they filtered out all the algae in the lake and basically put all the productivity down to the bottom of the lake. Once that happened, the prey fish had nothing to eat. When the prey fish don't have anything to eat, their numbers go down, and then your predator numbers follow. So we're in a very unique situation now where we have less prey fish in Lake Michigan than any time in its history. And we're starting to see another invasive brown goby actually start to increase in population. So we've seen a whole shift in all the Great Lakes because of this. Just to kind of explain that and to introduce some of the other invasives, you've probably seen zebra mussels when you've been out on the beach. So zebra mussels and quagga mussels look very similar. The quaggas are just a little bit bigger and can survive deeper. We also have invasives. These have come in from ballast water. It's called a spiny water flea. So this is one of the main plankton that are out there, but it's got this crazy spine on it. So if you're a small fish, you like that part, but you got to choke down that part in order to eat it. So that's caused problems. But basically with the zebra mussels, filtering out all this lower productivity, your diatoms and your plankton and things, it's affected all the way up through the food chain. And now we're seeing these species numbers go down, especially the Chinook salmon. The top graph is a series of zebra mussels as they came through Lake Michigan. So we saw them in the mid-90s. They peaked really in 2000, and zebra mussels have actually gone down. We see few zebra mussels out there, but their cousin came in shortly after and has exploded, and now we see quagga mussels covering the entire bottom of the lake from shoreline to shoreline. And what's different about the quaggas compared to the zebras, zebra mussels went out to about 100 feet, didn't survive beyond that. We're seeing the quagga mussels in the deepest part of Lake Michigan, which is over 900 feet deep. And so they are basically consistently filtering the water. They're a bivalve, so they're sucking in water through one hole and out the other, and filtering basically anything they can out of the water. Anything they don't like, they spit out in what's called a pseudofeces. So all the productivity is down the lake and the lake bottom now. So there's nothing in the water column for planktonic type organisms, for your zooplankton, for your prey fish. If anyone's been out on the Great Lakes, when I was first going out there in the 1980s, it was pretty cool because you could see down pretty consistently 30 feet, maybe 40 feet. Now when you go out there, you can see down 80 feet. So you can be out in 80 feet of water and look down and see a commercial net on the bottom, which was unheard of. So that just, yes, it looks clearer and it looks cleaner, but it's actually too clean. There's not enough nutrients and plankton out there to support the fish like it used to. So the zebra mussels and quaggas are not only a problem in the Great Lakes, they're throughout. Once they got in the Great Lakes, there's another connection to the Mississippi River, so similar to the Welland Canal. The Chicago waterway system has locks and dredge channels that connects the Great Lakes to basically the Illinois River to the Mississippi. So not only is it bad having connections because we get nasty things in the Great Lakes, but whatever gets into the Great Lakes then can filter throughout the rest of the country through the river system. And then once it's in an area, boaters and people who move water around, like in your live wells and things, can go out and visit places out west and transfer those species out that way. So there's lots of different pathways for these critters to move around. So today, because of the connections we have to the Great Lakes and because of how global the economy is now, we have over 180 non-indigenous aquatic species in the Great Lakes. So that's not even counting the species that, like the emerald ash borer and things that are hitting our forests. This is just aquatic. So they're coming from all over the world, and the only way we can really, the best thing we can do is try to prevent any more from coming in. Once they get here, you can see how difficult it is to deal with them. Sea lamprey costs $25 million a year. There hasn't been any control for zebra mussels. It costs billions a year for intake, water intake for cities and for cooling water to treat their pipes because they get zebra and quagga mussels in them. So it's very expensive to deal with once they're here. So prevention's the only thing we can do, I think, that makes sense. So the DNR and other states have been trying to convince our federal government and legislators that separating the Great Lakes is the best thing we can do. The shipping industry hates that idea, but there's some fairly easy ways where before ships especially get into Lake Erie, they could offload somehow to rail cars or to other ships that are just Great Lakes going ships, where we could try to prevent new species from coming in. So those are big things that we've been working on for many years to try to get done with the Great Lakes. And then educating people like yourselves that have boats or visit places that you have to clean your gear and clean your boats before you take it from one water body to another, because we're just as guilty moving species around. So, and they come in all shapes and sizes. This is a fairly recent invader. It's called the bloody red shrimp. It's really tiny, like 1/8 of an inch long or so, and it hatches out into a little tiny fly. It looks like a gnat, if you will. to really large fish. This is called a grass carp, which can reach up to 90 pounds. And we actually have grass carp in Michigan. They're illegal to stock, but people like to have them in their ponds. Grass carp eat vegetation, so they're quite inviting. If you have a pond that's loaded with weeds, you put one of these in there like a cow. One of these in a 5-acre pond will eliminate all the vegetation in it. And that's why we don't want them here. But they were actually brought to the U.S. For that purpose, to clean out ponds. But of course, things escape and then they get out into the wild and cause problems. So grass carp is an Asian carp. It's already here. The other two grass carp or Asian carp that you're reading about a lot in the news is the silver carp and the bighead carp. And they are advancing quickly up the Mississippi and are in the Chicago shipping canal system. So we are urging a separation there as quick as we can. The silver carp, this is in the Mississippi River system. It might be the Illinois River system. When they feel any sort of agitation from boat motors, they just go crazy on the surface. So this is what we don't want to see in our river systems and in the Great Lakes if silver carp get here. This is called a bighead carp, and this was taken in Illinois by a bow fisherman, but they get huge. These are both filter feeders. So luckily, they probably haven't, if any have gotten into the Great Lakes, they haven't taken off because we don't have a lot of plankton in the water. So these are filter feeders just like zebra mussels. So there's not a lot in the Great Lakes for these to eat. But there is in our river systems. So the lower Kalamazoo River, the lower St. Joe River, the Grand River, Muskegon, this is what we're concerned about if this species gets here, is that they're going to thrive in those type of river systems. So this is what our main battle is, or one of our battles for new invasives. Just one example of hundreds that are out there that we're trying to keep out. So this is Chicago. Chicago, right at Chicago, was a small connection to Lake Michigan. And when Chicago grew and got too big, there wasn't good sewage treatment at the time, and their sewage was going directly into Lake Michigan. And that was not good to have sewage floating around right in front of your city. So they built this, what's called a sanitary canal, but it also turned out to be a shipping canal. And they closed off the rivers to Lake Michigan and sent all of their wastewater down through the sanitary canal to the Illinois River system, to the Mississippi. So that's why there was a natural barrier there, but that's why there's now a connection to the Mississippi River, is basically to send Chicago sewage downstream. So these Asian carp are advancing up through the system here. To try to stop them, electrical barriers were placed here, and for the most part they've been successful, we think. But we found environmental DNA from these, both silver and bighead carp, getting closer to Lake Michigan. So this is another artificial connection that was made. So there's 2 points that Asian carp could get in, through the Calumet River and then up through the Chicago River. And we're already seeing this environmental DNA there, which means that some part of the fish, it could be fish slime, it could be, could even be feces from a bird that ate an Asian carp, had passed that DNA up into these areas. So, or it could be actual live Asian carp. So this is the battlegrounds of where we're trying to stop it. And what we're pushing for is, there's a Brandon Road lock system, and we think that's a great place to create a barrier to fish movement, a natural physical barrier to fill in the canal there, and have some sort of offloading system where you can load barges coming up this way to Great Lakes barges on this side. So, but it's coming with a lot of, obviously the shipping industry doesn't want to change it. Our government basically just wants to study the situation and not do something, and comes with a pretty hefty price tag. You know, some price tags up to $1 billion, but I think for about $20 million we can get really close to having something good done there. And for a $7 billion industry for fishing in the Great Lakes, I think that's money well spent. But we got to convince the right people. What's that?
Warren Buffett.
Yeah, he could write a check tomorrow, couldn't he? So anyone know what the biggest biological threat is after all that? What's that? Close. People. So all these problems were created by us. And I say human beings here, and I guess the only ones I can really rule out is the true Native Americans that were here understood the relationship of how they could use the resource and not impact it. But European settlers and folks that came here, it was all mostly about greed and making more money, and as a result, not that that's, we all have to make money, but we made some very bad decisions that we didn't learn about till later that have created this cycle of affecting the Great Lakes, from introducing these invasive species to pollution. We're getting pollution under control now, to just really bad decisions. But the good point is we caused the problem, we can stop it, and we can reverse it. And I'm pretty confident that we can do that. So what's going to keep the Great Lakes great? Pollution control is well under its way since the Clean Water Act. Our river systems are cleaner than they've been in a long time. We still have some problems with contaminated sediments, and anyone who's from the Kalamazoo knows about PCBs, and we still have issues here, but things are looking better. But what's the pollution of tomorrow? You may have read newspaper articles about microbeads. These are little plastic things that are put into shampoos and soaps and different things. They're popping up into the Great Lakes and causing problems. So fish out there that are already hungry, looking for plankton, are mistaking these microbeads for plankton, and it's basically plastic, so they're getting no nutrient value from them at all. So there's a big push to outlaw microbeads in the Great Lakes. So keeping an eye, doing research and keeping an eye for different new things that are coming out. If we can stop them early, we can prevent big problems. Talked enough about invasive species. We got to prevent them from coming in here. Good resource management. I think we're smarter now. We don't go in and totally clear cut the entire state and expect it to recover. So wise use of our resources, wise land use. Conservation districts do a lot of work with this, working with private landowners to keep nutrients from entering our water, keep sediment from moving. Good fish management is going to be part of that. Nearshore habitat protection and restoration. You've seen, like I showed the picture of St. Joe, where we've converted industry more into tourism marinas. But in some areas, we actually have to restore them back to marshes like they were if we expect to see the lakes to reproduce the fish that they once had. Muskegon Lake is a good example of a lake system that was totally industrialized that is now had a lot of work done to restore its lake frontage and actually restore habitat there. So we're making some advances there. Water withdrawal is going to be a huge issue again. The Great Lakes are increasing, which is good, but there's always going to be pressure from the west, especially the desert states, to want to get some of our water. It comes and goes. We've got international and state laws to protect our water, but you never know when the demands on it are going to get so high, and then someone's going to want to start shipping our water off. So keeping an eye on that and not allowing that to happen is something we need to do. Nutrient and sediment reductions. We are actually, this is still an issue, even though the mussels have changed the ecosystem in the Great Lakes and they're so clear now, people are forgetting that nutrients are still bad. The nutrients are still in the lake, they're just stored on the bottom. And the last thing we want to do is continue to put nutrients, excessive nutrients into the lake systems, because I'm sure one day the quagga mussels are going to die and all that nutrients going to be recirculated. We actually have angler groups that want us to go out and put phosphorus in the lake to get the nutrient and productivity going again. There's aquaculture industries that want to put net pen fish out there to raise fish and basically feed them, and we're concerned about, you know, where does that nutrients from all the fish food go when you have them out there. So people are looking at the lakes thinking that they're lacking nutrients because they're so clear, and we could be at a point where people are going to want to introduce more nutrients, which I think is wrong. And then just encouraging people to go see the Great Lakes. If you get a chance to visit them once a year, great. Visit them more often. Take people to them. Because I think the more people see them and enjoy them and appreciate them, then we're going to have a better chance of protecting them into the future. And that's about all I had for this, and we're getting close on time too. Do we